When we get, say, like a 50% return rate on the controls, then we know that about half of them would be seen if they were there. And so that means that the 20% return rate probably actually represents 40%.
It's not.
Yeah.
There's a centipede. We need to get those two marks before we put it back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Alright, do you want to mark them?
You guys can have the ones
Squirm, let's go.
you can do 728
That's good.
if you want.
Sorry, buddy.
Wait.
Yes.
We're gonna miss each other.
I'm gonna miss the community here at WNL.
I'll miss the WNL community.
But what I'm gonna miss the most is being able to leave my backpack everywhere.
I will miss the speaking tradition the most.
I'm gonna miss D Hall and Gaines the most.
And I'm going to miss D Hall the most. It's all you can eat, $10.
The thing I'm gonna miss most about Washington and Lee is the dining hall. Come on, baby. You can't beat that all-you-can-eat brunch. Whoa!
And I'm gonna miss all my friends in the colonnade.
I guess the most I'll miss is just being in colonnade, taking in the sun, watching everything that happens around me.
The Connolly Entrepreneurship Center, as well as my good friend Dr. Shea.
And we're gonna miss having close relationships with professors, just being able to stop in office hours and talk about anything and everything.
I miss most about Washington and Lee is the great professors, and great classes, and the easy accessibility of those professors.
Dr. Melissa Karen, she's the love of my life, and I'm going into South Asian Studies because of her.
Professor Eastwood, I've definitely majored in Eastwood instead of sociology. I've taken every single one of his classes.
And I'm going to be missing Anna Brodsky and her incredible Russian lessons the most.
Definitely Professor Prager in the German department.
Definitely. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Because she's, amazing.
And shout out to Professor McCormick. I'm really going to miss being in your class.
Anything taught by Professor Delaney.
Professor Meyer's Civil War class, just because he was so energetic and enthusiastic about the material.
Dr. Eric Elfelman, because the amount of free ice creams and lunches I've gotten from that man is extraordinary.
I'm definitely gonna miss the English department the most. I really love everyone in the Shepherd department just because of how much of community and family we all are.
And what I miss the most is all of the unique experiences I've been able to have with my different classes here.
I'm going to miss the Science Center and singing with the university singers.
We're gonna miss games on Watt.
I'm gonna miss my friends so much, but also Sweet Things Ice Cream Shop.
And I think I'm gonna miss TAPS the most.
And I'm gonna miss Blue Sky the most.
And I'm gonna miss the small community of Lexington and walking into restaurants and knowing more than half the people there and just feeling really loved by everyone in the city and at the school.
And I'm gonna miss sending Windfall with my boys the most.
The views, the sunsets on Windfall. And I'll miss the Lexington sunsets the most.
Great friends and the people.
I'm gonna miss the people here the most.
I'm gonna miss the people from WNL the most.
The thing we're gonna miss most about WNL is all our friends.
What I will miss most are my forever friends.
I'm really gonna miss friends that become family.
I'm really, really, really gonna miss all the amazing friends that I made here at WNL.
I'm going to miss the Colonnade.
WLU Lex,
Pink Professor Mitchell Moore,
Pronto,
Lex Bricks.
the pink Cadillac,
I can't decide.
everything.
Everything.
All right, good morning. Later in the program, I'm going to give some additional talks that are literally chapters from the book I've just finished about George Herbert Walker Bush. One will deal with a controversial cabinet nomination that he made early in his presidency. The other will deal with a very controversial international intervention that he carries out at the very end of his presidency. This talk is different. I want to do a couple of different things in the time I have with you, and I want to leave lots of time for your questions and discussion. First, I want to put the Bush 41 administration and the president in the context of modern presidency in general. So I'll say some things about his background and the background of the other presidents who served in recent memory. That shouldn't take too long with an audience like this one. It takes a little longer with 18-year-olds who don't have the background you do in American politics and American political events. Then I want to talk a bit more than I was able to last night about the 1988 presidential campaign. It's an interesting one in a number of respects. And I actually want to say some critical things about that campaign because in many ways it ignored the most important issues that were facing the country at the time. Of course, that's not all that unusual with presidential campaigns, but in this case, I want to draw our attention to that. And then finally, I want to say a few words about the mistake that is commonly made in commentary about the Bush presidency. There are many, but I want to draw your attention to the one that I think is the most important. The thing that's commonly said about President Bush is not just wrong, but it's a lot wrong. Just to not leave that hanging, I want to say that when we describe George Herbert Walker Bush as cautious and prudent, we're wrong. In his style, in his rhetoric, he often was a cautious person. In his actions in the White House, I think we see a very different story, and that's the thing I want to draw your attention to and see what your reaction is in the comments and questions. All right. Presidents arrive in the White House from different places. Herbert Walker Bush has a very common one. He goes from the vice presidency to the White House. It's also common to be a governor and be elected president. It's a little less common to be a senator, although of course some of these people were senators before they were vice presidents. And it's very unusual to have no prior elected office. And even Eisenhower, who had no prior elected office, had a full career of public service before he ran for the presidency. So Bush is in this group, and I want to just emphasize one difference he has from the others. The others had won a number of statewide races to be a senator from Texas or from California, or of course elected to the vice presidency as well, a longtime member of the House, Truman elected to the Senate as well. Bush tries for a Senate seat twice in Texas and misses both times. He does serve in the House of Representatives, but for only 2 terms. That's unusual. He's less of a politician in some respects than the other vice presidents who ascend to the presidency. All right, some more background information. I think it's possible to describe some of the individuals who become president as lifelong politicians. Somewhere in their 20s, they start running for office, and they never stop. That's certainly true of Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Bill Clinton. Some do something else before their political career begins. And again, Herbert Walker is in that category. You can't say that W. and Truman had a lot of success as young men, but later in their careers they did before arriving in the White House. And Obama is a difficult one to describe as well. He goes to the White House from the Senate, but I think he served in the Senate for 2 years. And that's a very unusual path to arrive on the national scene and 2 years later ascend to the White House. How did the presidencies end? It's common to win 2 terms. If you want to count Kennedy-Johnson as one administration, then there'd be one more on the list of 2-term administrations. It's uncommon to be defeated, or less common to be defeated, as a sitting president. Ford is, Carter is, and of course, Bush as well. Truman and Johnson could have run in 1952 and in 1968. They chose not to. If you add them to those who were defeated, the 2 lists are a closer match. And of course, Nixon resigned. Kennedy was assassinated. All right, some more of this background comparison. Most of our presidents don't come from wealthy, privileged, upper-class families. Some do, and 2 come from the same family. That's not the typical background. Most of our presidents grew up in small towns and had families of relatively modest means. I suppose Carter's family was wealthy for the area of Georgia he lived in. He wasn't wealthy for the rest of America. Among those who are wealthy and privileged, a few go to Ivy League colleges. 2 transferred into Ivy League colleges, Obama and Trump. Others attended schools we all know about, military academies, University of Michigan, Georgetown, and some went to places, what? It's reassuring to young people to know if you don't get into a great college, there's still a future. You can ascend to the highest levels. And of course, Truman didn't have any college degree. This is the famous Bush resume. And it's often said he had one of the richest resumes at the time he was elected to the presidency. I want to point out a couple things about it. I've already mentioned that his electoral success is relatively modest. He wins in a Houston congressional district twice. It's a relatively safe district for a Republican. In the Barry Goldwater year, 1964, he runs for the Senate in Texas. That's still a period of time in which the Democratic Party is the dominant party in the state of Texas. He does better than Barry Goldwater, but he does not win that election. He comes back 6 years later, gives up his safe seat in Congress, and runs again. He was expecting to run against a very liberal member of the Senate who decides not to seek another term. Lloyd Benson, well, he decided because he lost the primary, right? Lloyd Benson, a more conservative Democrat, wins the nomination in 1970 and then takes the Senate seat. Following that, he does the list of things we know about. I interviewed one person who worked in the administration who said, you have to remember, George Herbert Walker Bush isn't like other presidents. He's more like a British prime minister. He's someone who was given difficult tasks that he performed well, and he was rewarded by being given another difficult task. And that's the most important learning period in his public service, and it's unusual. We don't typically have a president who does the variety of things that George Herbert Walker Bush did. Moreover, two of the things on that list should have killed his political career. He was the head of the Republican Party during Watergate. Talk about thankless jobs. He performs it with real finesse. He is supportive of the president until the end, when he, of course, is not, and holds the party together in this very controversial, very difficult time. The other job that should have killed his political career was director of the CIA. It is presumed that that position ought to be held by someone who is nonpartisan, someone who isn't running for office. When he takes the assignment as the director of the CIA, Ford makes an announcement, I won't think of him as a vice presidential nominee, though there had been talk about that as a possibility prior to the 1976 presidential campaign. Moreover, the presumption is, once you do that job, you really won't be able to return to politics. George Herbert Walker Bush really likes the job as CIA director. It's again an enormous challenge because the CIA had been investigated by the Senate and House of Representatives for a variety of controversial things that had happened earlier in their history. They were at a low point in terms of institutional morale and institutional respect across the country. In a very short time, Bush manages to turn that around, and he actually goes to President Carter and says, if you want, I'll stay in this job. Had Carter said yes, that would have ended, I think, his political career, at least for running for national office. Carter doesn't, and 4 years later, he makes a run for the White House. An unsuccessful run, but a run that has surprising success early on. He wins in Iowa. He and Reagan are the two principal opponents, loses the nomination, and eventually becomes the vice presidential nominee. Again, I want to make the point I've already made, but just to repeat it. He's not a great campaigner. His son is going to win 2 statewide races in Texas. His dad won 2 statewide races in Connecticut. He does not ride the rise of the Republican Party in Texas and in the South that he was hoping to and that many people expected him to. He's not the strongest campaigner in the world. He has early success in '80, loses it on the stage of a debate in New Hampshire. His claim or his argument that he should be elected in 1988 has more to do with the range of experience than it does with electoral success. All right, the day he announces that he's running for his own term, 1988, Newsweek hammers him. The story in Newsweek is actually not that bad. It's a long profile about his heroics in World War II, the various jobs he has held, the many friends he has across the country. It's not a terrible story. The headline was bad. The headline was the suggestion that he's not a strong-willed and powerful person. That wimp factor was a quote from a number of people who I think were trying to damage his presidential campaign, and argued that the loyalty he had for Ronald Reagan was excessive. He was too quiet in his White House years, not sufficiently independent, and maybe not a real member of the Reagan Revolution. That label did real damage to his run in 1988. And it's, again, one of those labels that I want to argue with you or for you later on is wildly wrong. His campaign in 1988 involves a particular political strategist, Lee Atwater, who had been a partner of Roger Stone and Paul Manafort. That used to be something you would put on your resume. You might not do that any longer. Atwater was a tough campaigner and ran a strategic campaign that succeeded. Lee Atwater said that we are going to win against Michael Dukakis because I am going to make more voters know the name of Willie Horton than know the name of Bush's vice president. We are going to tie that name to his campaign. This is an ad that shows Willie Horton's face. The Bush campaign never ran an ad that showed his face. Outside groups did. Outside groups that don't coordinate with the central presidential campaign. If you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you something. But nevertheless, it was in some ways an unfair attack on Dukakis. Dukakis had been the governor of Massachusetts when a prisoner, Willie Horton, went on a furlough and then went on a crime spree, stabbing a young man, raping his fiancée. A horrendous crime. It wasn't necessarily Dukakis' fault. He didn't review who gets furloughs in the state prison. He didn't sign the legislation that created the furlough program. That was done by a previous governor. I think there was a furlough program in California that Ronald Reagan had signed off on. It was common at that point in prison administration. Nevertheless, that horrendous crime, and particularly the fact that it was a crime by a black criminal against white victims, sent a message that Atwater thought would be very important, very helpful in the campaign. I call it a vapid and vacuous campaign. Again, it's not the only one. There are many that fit that description. Here's why I think we missed opportunities in 1988. There were two big questions, one domestic, one foreign, that hardly got talked about in 1988. The domestic issue was, what are we going to do about the debt? Reagan's administration had begun with a $1 trillion national debt. That sounds so quaint, doesn't it? How could anyone have worried about a $1 trillion national debt? It ended with a $4 trillion national debt and a kind of frozen Washington. There wasn't new money to do anything. There were large Democratic majorities in the House and Senate. Bush is going to enter the White House with the largest majorities of the opposition party in control of Congress. There were plenty of things that got vetoed, plenty of problems associated with it. What are we going to do? What are we going to do about the deficit problem? Neither candidate talked about it. Bush famously said, I won't raise taxes. That was the line from his acceptance speech that got the biggest applause and the most attention thereafter. Dukakis promised all kinds of new programs, but whenever he was asked, how are you going to pay for that, he didn't really have an answer. Sound familiar? So neither was talking realistically about what we would have to do if indeed the deficit was a problem to be taken seriously. On the international side, the Cold War was coming to an end. In 1988, Margaret Thatcher declared that it was over. So did George Shultz, the outgoing Secretary of State. Even Ronald Reagan, who in his final year made a visit to Moscow, was asked, how does it feel to be visiting the evil empire? He stopped the reporter and said, no, that was a different time. This is a different place. The Cold War was coming to an end, and that led to lots of important questions. Well, what's that going to mean for the defense budget? What's that going to mean for European security? What do these developments that were then going on in Poland, in Hungary, elsewhere in Eastern Europe, how far will they go? What do they mean? There was hardly any talk about that in 1988 at all. There were 3 presidential debates, 2 by the presidential candidates, 1 by the vice presidents. In all of that, there was one question. One question. What do you think about Gorbachev? What do you think the future of US-Soviet relations were? Neither Dukakis or Bush said anything interesting in response to that question. Now, during the campaign, President Bush, or candidate Bush, gave a very important speech in Chicago about his foreign policy vision for US-Soviet relations. It was a speech in which he was, for the first time in many ways, critical of Ronald Reagan. In the speech, he said, Reagan got it wrong in his first term. He was way too hard on the Soviet Union. The evil empire pushed things too far. And he got it wrong in his second term, too. The cozying up to Gorbachev, the talk when they met to talk about the possible elimination of nuclear weapons altogether was going way too far. The Reagan administration did well, the speech said, in its relations with the Soviet Union, but the tone of their messaging was too harsh and too soft. I'm going to come in and balance that. That was a really interesting speech. Nobody talked about it because it was delivered in the same week that Michael Dukakis rode around in a tank. And everybody just wanted to talk about that picture, the doofus hat, and what it suggested about his weakness. We missed a big opportunity in 1988. It would have been nice if the American public had been let in on what the 2 candidates hoped to do, expected to do, what they thought about the changes that were taking place in the world order. It didn't happen. Arguably, the most important question in the candidate debates was the inappropriate one that was asked of Michael Dukakis. You're an opponent of the death penalty. What would you do if your wife, Kitty, was raped and murdered? How would you feel about the treatment we should give to that perpetrator? Dukakis gave an incredibly low-key, awkward, and unemotional answer. Now, that may have been revealing. He was a kind of low-key, unemotional person. And the American public may have seen something about his character from that response. But that question dwarfed all the various attempts reporters might have made to ask about the substance of domestic and international politics. This is the map we looked at briefly last night with a little more detail about the intensity of support that Bush won in 1988. In terms of the Electoral College, this is a very decisive victory, 400 26 to 111. But as I mentioned last night, it's the last time there's a decisive Republican victory in presidential politics. Bush was the last Republican to win California. He was the last Republican to win Illinois. After his campaign, no one wins on the Republican side, Connecticut, Maryland, or Vermont. Moreover, and more pertinent to our recent experience, he was the last Republican to win Michigan and Pennsylvania until, of course, Trump does in 2016. I want to again save this topic for our question and answer, for discussion with you. I'm very interested in why you think this happened. What happened to the Republican Party's strength between 1988 and 1992? All right, presidential approval ratings. This doesn't have everyone. I'm sorry, I don't have the Obama and Trump numbers. We can say a bit about them on a slide that's coming up. A couple things about presidential approval. First, it's very rare. Eisenhower and Kennedy never dip below 50%. Kennedy's was, of course, a partial term. But they remain popular presidents throughout their time in the White House. Everyone else crosses that line, except, of course, Donald Trump, who has never gotten above 50%. The patterns appear to be different from administration to administration. Let me tell you what I think is the most important pattern we're looking at. For a president who has peace and prosperity, Eisenhower, Reagan, and Clinton, the movement has a relatively narrow range. Never wildly popular, never wildly unpopular. The movement tends to be patterned after national economic numbers. Not always, but tends to be patterned after national economic numbers. There's a recession late in Eisenhower's presidency. When things get better for Clinton in the 1990s, his approval rating goes up. We think of Reagan as very popular, which he was when he left office, but 1981 was a deep recession, and there was a lot of skepticism about the Reagan administration in his first year. So there are the peace and prosperity presidents who tend to have this narrow range in which they bounce around. Then there are the presidents who have controversial wars overseas. This line for Truman is the Korean War. This is, of course, Johnson in Vietnam. For Nixon, this is almost certainly the Watergate experience. And for W, the controversy and growing controversy of the war in Iraq. The really odd one on the list is ours, Herbert Walker Bush. That peak is victory in the first Gulf War. But then there's this huge fall-off. You can understand a fall-off in Korea. You can understand a fall-off in Vietnam. You can understand a fall-off in Iraq. Why is there a fall-off after victory? It's again an economic downturn. It's not that severe an economic downturn. There is a recession that occurs at the end of Bush's presidency, but it's not as severe as the one that Reagan endured. It's not as severe, certainly, as the one we get at the end of the Bush administration, but it did lead to that dramatic drop. Again, I'm curious about what you think. Why did that occur? And what was that pattern about? Here's a different way of measuring the mood of the country. Presidential approval rating is one. This is the standard question that is sometimes asked, is the country moving in the right direction? This is from Gallup. They ask it this way: are you satisfied with the way things are going in the United States? And I want to draw our attention to that right side, Obama and Trump, but first say a bit about what the regular pattern looks like. It again goes up and down, right? Is the country heading in the right direction? We often get, oh yes we are. That's 1991, beginning of 1991 victory against Saddam Hussein. That 70% for George W. Bush is 9/11 and the response to it, and the rally around the flag that occurred. So how people feel about the direction of the country tracks presidential approval. It is often a reflection of things that presidents have done. It's often a reflection of things that the presidents didn't have any control over and have driven, again, public sentiment in a positive or negative direction. Beginning with Obama, there's never a recovery, right? How people feel about the country goes to a very low place in the Great Recession, as it would be expected to. The most serious economic crisis since the Great Depression drives many Americans to worry about our future. There is a recovery. It's slow, but it does occur. And for neither Obama nor Trump do we go back to high points. Do we go back to feeling good about the future? That may be related to the rise in partisanship in American politics. It may be related because we no longer ever think that we're headed in the right direction if the person in the White House doesn't belong to our tribe, our party, our point of view. This is the last one to deal with this subject. It repeats. This time you're looking at presidential approval divided by party. And the party of the president is the line at top, the party of the opposition at the bottom. And a couple things I want to draw our attention to. One is that for most of our recent history, Democrats and Republicans moved together, right? When Eisenhower has that recession, Democrats don't like it, Republicans don't like it either, right? When we come back and when Eisenhower is popular at the end of his term, he's clearly more popular with Republicans than with Democrats, but they both move up. Moreover, the range between those two is not enormous. It's certainly not as big as it becomes with Clinton, with W, with Obama, and with Trump. So range matters. The pattern of moving together is somewhat, I think, reassuring. When Nixon has his Watergate problem, it's not just Democrats who lose faith in him, it's Republicans as well. Okay, for George Herbert Walker Bush, he actually looks more like these earlier presidents. The distance between his Republican and Democratic supporters isn't that great. Reagan, Clinton, his son, Obama, much more divisive than is George Herbert Walker Bush. And then there's, again, this important thing to note near the end. Obama doesn't have Republicans and Democrats moving in any common pattern. He's losing Republican support all along. All right. This is the word almost everyone associates with George Herbert Walker Bush. They get it largely not from Bush, but from Dana Carvey. Bush had a good sense of humor. He didn't mind people making fun of him. the end of his administration, he invites Dana Carvey to come sleep at the White House and attend the Christmas party in the White House. Barbara Bush is not fond of this invitation. But Bush thought it would be funny. Carvey comes and says, I had fun last night sleeping in the White House. I picked up the phone, called the Secret Service, and in the president's voice said, you know, I want to take a jog tonight. I think I'm going to run in the nude. And he said, I looked out the window and I could see all the Secret Service people running in circles around the White House lawn. He also explained how you do President Bush. He said, if you want to imitate him, you start off with Mr. Rogers. You talk slowly. You talk calmly. You don't use big words, right? You start off as Mr. Rogers, but that doesn't get you to a good imitation. You have to throw in John Wayne. And I've always liked that description because indeed, Bush has his John Wayne moments, and that's what people tend to miss. All right. I want to talk about some of those bolder John Wayne moments in the Bush presidency because, again, I don't think they get as much public attention as they should. Richard Nixon, in the piece that's in your binder, I repeat this quote. He was having a conversation with Larry King, and he says, everybody underestimates George Bush. That's a big mistake. You tend to write him off, you don't take him seriously, and then he does the big play. There are lots of big plays in Bush's life and career. When he graduates from high school, he does not have to go into the military. The draft doesn't yet exist. His parents don't want him to go into the military. Go to college, get some additional education. You can serve later in the Second World War. He defies his parents. No, I'm going now. That's an interesting decision. When he comes back from the war, graduates from Yale, the family has lined things up for him. Do you want to go to Wall Street? We have connections. You can arrive as a clerk and a few years later be a vice president. There's a career for you in your father's circle of friends. He says, no, I don't want to do that. I want to go off and do things on my own. And even though he has family help along the way, he's not alone. Nevertheless, the decision to move to Texas is a kind of surprising one. He makes bold decisions kind of throughout his life. One of the books we read talks about his Texas oil business. He and a neighbor, when they form Zapata Oil, each commit to raising $500,000, real money at that time, to put in to this oil business, and then they bet it all on one field. That's not typical. You would get a lease for one field, but then you'd sell fractions of it to other people to cover your bets. Or you would take your money and buy fractions of other people's leases so that you'd be drilling in lots of different places and cover your bets that way. Bush doesn't do that. He and his partner invest it all in one shot. Now they drill 127 wells and they all hit. That was not a bad decision, right? But it was a bold decision. And our author tells us there were lots of people in Texas who were utterly surprised that George Bush did that. Sure, people do that in the oil business. Risk everything on one shot, but George Bush risked everything on one shot? He did. He was bolder than we gave him credit for. And I want to draw your attention in my remaining moments to October 1990 and two important decisions that Bush made. October 1990 should have been a great month for the president. That was the month that German reunification was finalized. And not just finalized, but finalized on the terms that the president wanted. A united Germany that would be a continuing member of the European Union, a continuing member of the NATO alliance. It is one of the biggest diplomatic successes of his 4-year term, and is little remembered, partly because it went so smoothly and succeeded beyond the expectations of most expert advisors. October 1990 was not a good month. Bush says it was the worst in his presidency. And there were two crisis situations. One involved writing the budget for 1991. When Bush first arrives in the White House, he keeps his pledge, no new taxes. That's very hard to do. He keeps his pledge, no new taxes, works out a compromise with the Democrats in which they play games with projected tax revenues, play games with various other things, sell off some federal assets to raise at least a little bit of revenue to cover the deficit, and promise the American people that they are complying with a law that was passed at the end of the Reagan administration, the Gramm-Rudman Act, sometimes called the Gramm-Rudman-Hollins Act, that mandated congressional action to address the deficit, and said, if Congress fails to address the deficit, there will be across-the-board budget cuts. There will be sequestration, which we came to call it later on. They finesse it in 1989, just barely get through the year without having to significantly or in a meaningful way raise taxes. But 1990 is not a kind year. The budget is in much more serious arrears, and there's going to have to be compromise. In the summer of 1990, Bush got in enormous trouble by, in some ways, reneging on his no new taxes pledge. In the summer of 1990, in July, he said, we're negotiating between the White House and the Democrats on Capitol Hill, and everything is on the table. Well, that set off the alarm bells. Everything on the table, it means he's going to raise taxes. He took enormous criticism at the time, but October is the crunch. October 1st is when you need to pass a new budget for the next fiscal year. And the president indeed works out a budget compromise with the Democrats that includes new taxes. It does not include changes in the income tax rates. It doesn't include any alteration of the percentage you pay at the different steps in income tax, but it does involve new taxes. It does involve cuts in spending that lots of the Democrats are unhappy about. And at Bush's insistence, the negotiations between the White House and the Democrats also try to get at this long-term problem. We can't have a budget crisis every year. How are we going to manage this in the future? Bush insists there have to be changes on Capitol Hill. And the changes that are proposed are substantial. This is when we get pay-as-you-go. This is when we get rules changed in the House and Senate that say you can't create a new program unless you tell the American people where the money to pay for it is going to come from. If you create a new program, you have to raise revenue. If you create a new program, you have to cut spending somewhere else. Pay-as-you-go gets incorporated. Moreover, there are technical changes to the rules by which budgets are made and approved in the House and Senate that have the effect of restraining individual members from succeeding in getting to the floor with new and expensive proposals. The agreement at the beginning of October of 1990 does mean the president is compromising on his central promise in '88, and Newt Gingrich rebels. He's then a rising star in the House of Representatives, part of the leadership team that was negotiating with the White House, had said he was on board with the compromises that were being made, but at the last minute pulls out. He then makes an unholy alliance, there are lots of those in Washington, right, with the liberal Democrats who don't like the spending cuts that are part of the package. Together, they defeat the budget. That leads to a month of public negotiations that are swirling in controversy. For Bush's critics, Gingrich has given you an opportunity. You can go back and keep your promise. You can join him and say there'll be no new taxes. Bush is advised to do that by at least some members of his White House staff and outside advisors. He doesn't. He goes back to negotiations with the Democrats, but now he's going back in a weak position. He can't deliver votes in the House of Representatives. They have a stronger case to be made, and they force an increase in the tax rate for the upper bracket. This is the issue that dominates newspapers in October of 1990. I think the front page story in the New York Times, the one above the fold, the important story, is on the budget 17 or 18 days in the month of October. And the president is fully aware of, well, I should take that back. He's certainly aware that it's going to be a costly decision for him to sign on legislation that ends the no new taxes pledge. I'm not sure he knows how damaging it will be, but he knows it's going to hurt him. His approval rating is declining at this point. And he sees the writing on the wall about how difficult this would be. He decides to do it anyway. And he believes that that decision was important because of those long-term commitments that he gets from Capitol Hill that have at least the possibility of fixing the problem. And indeed, there are two fixes to the Reagan deficits. One takes place in October 1990 in this compromise. The other takes place in the first year of Clinton's administration when he doesn't do a typical Democratic budget and both raises taxes and keeps a lid on spending. Those two steps are the things that get us to a point where we can actually have a balanced budget later in the 1990s. Clinton gets credit for that. Clinton claims credit for that on a regular basis. So do the Republicans on Capitol Hill who compromised with him to get to those balanced budgets. This important step in that process is forgotten. Persian Gulf. They are related. In August, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. Within a day or two, the president has made his public announcement, this will not stand. Within a couple of days, there's a commitment to put American troops in Saudi Arabia to defend it against any further aggression on the part of Saddam Hussein. It's now October. The president has put together this remarkable coalition of countries in Europe, Asia, and in the Middle East, all united in opposition to Saddam Hussein, all cooperating in sanctions against Iraq. It's frequently said putting together that coalition was an important accomplishment for Bush. Bush is convinced it wasn't putting it together, it was holding it together. It was constantly under strain. In October, the Soviet Union is sending representatives around the Middle East trying to sell some negotiated resolution that will allow Saddam Hussein to save face and not pay a penalty for having invaded his neighbor. The president is opposed to that. Jordan, King of Jordan, is proposing a compromise that, again, the president has to fight against. In Israel, the largest demonstration that results in violence at the Temple Mount takes place. And Israeli security forces kill, I think, 22 demonstrators in Jerusalem. The largest loss of life on a single day in Jerusalem in the Israeli experience. And the United Nations then prepares to condemn Israel. Bush is caught by that. He works hard to moderate the UN condemnation of Israel, but in the end, the United States has to vote for it. Has to vote for it because, again, how are you going to keep the anti-Saddam Hussein coalition together if Saddam Hussein succeeds in presenting himself as the real champion of Palestinians, and you don't join that cause with the rest of the international community? Moreover, October 1990 is the time when one of the most important decisions in the Gulf War has to be made. The deployment of American troops to Saudi Arabia to defend Saudi Arabia is finishing. We have over 200,000 troops. We have lots of airplanes. We have 3 aircraft carrier task forces. They're all in place. We are fully able, says Central Command, to defend Saudi Arabia against Saddam Hussein. Well, what if we have to use force against Saddam Hussein? Are we ready? The president asked that question, and early in October, there's a briefing that he and his senior national security advisors receive, and they're appalled. The Pentagon says, well, if we have to take action against Saddam Hussein, and we might have had to take action at any moment. He might have begun to do harm to the U.S. citizens who were being more or less held hostage in Iraq. He might have done something else provocative. We might have had to use military force. When he asked the Pentagon what would it look like, they say, well, we would stand up in Saudi Arabia, march across the border, and go directly after Saddam Hussein's defensive positions, a direct assault. How many casualties would that produce? A very large number. So the president is disappointed with that, so is the Pentagon, so is Dick Cheney, so is Brent Scowcroft. Go back to the drawing board. They come back at the end of the month with a very different plan. Let's double our deployment to Saudi Arabia, and we'll send armored divisions across southern Iraq in a sweeping movement, encircle the Iraqi forces in Kuwait, and beat them without a direct confrontation. That becomes the plan that the president adopts at the end of the month. But I want to briefly describe to you, and then bring this to a conclusion, briefly describe to you that National Security Council meeting. And it's a vivid description that you get from Robert Gates, who was there and later gave an oral history. Gates was convinced that the Pentagon plan presented at the end of October was not serious. He thought they had in mind, we'll tell the president what it would take to win the war easily, and the price will be so high, the president will back down and say, well, we'll just defend Saudi Arabia and wait for the sanctions to work their will. And indeed, the briefing takes place, and the Pentagon says, we're going to need 6 aircraft carriers off the coast of Iraq. We had never put 6 aircraft carriers off the coast of anybody. That was a huge number. We're going to take the best armored divisions in Central Europe, the ones in Germany that have been defending NATO for decades. We're going to move them to Saudi Arabia. We're going to double the number of troops from 200,000 to close to 500,000. Moreover, in order to do that, we're going to call up the reserves because we don't have enough troops otherwise. And here's the kicker. After we do this, we're going to have to use that force or bring them home. There's no rotation. If we put 500,000 troops in the Persian Gulf, we have to use them or bring them home. It's more or less a decision to go to war. Gates doesn't believe the president is going to buy this at all. And he says, to my dying day, I will remember vividly what George Bush did. At the end of the briefing, he stood up, grabbed his chair, and said, you've got it. Let me know if you need anything else. Leaves the room. And then Cheney says to Scowcroft, does he know what he just did? And Scowcroft, Cheshire smile, oh yes, he does. That's an important element in understanding Bush. When the big play is necessary, he does it. That's the thing we most often misunderstand about him. The Kennedy Foundation gave him the Profile of Courage Award for the budget decision. We know what happened in Desert Storm. So, was George Bush a wimp? I don't think so. Neither does Manuel Noriega. Neither does Saddam Hussein. Was he prudent? Again, in style, in rhetoric, perhaps. But German reunification was an incredibly bold move that he takes a leading role in, and he does the same in the First Gulf War. Thank you. Now, remind me, 10 minutes?